Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 29th paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz Vom Kriege, the title being Theory therefore considers the nature of ends and means in tactics. The text follows. Theory has therefore to consider the nature of the means and ends. In tactics, the means are the disciplined armed forces which are to carry on the contest. The object is victory. The precise definition of this conception can be better explained hereafter in the consideration of the combat. Here we content ourselves by denoting the retirement of the enemy from the field of battle as the sign of victory. By means of this victory, strategy gains the object for which it appointed the combat, and which constitutes its special signification. The signification has certainly some influence on the nature of the victory. A victory which is intended to weaken the enemy's armed forces is a different thing from one which is designed only to put us in possession of a position. The signification of a combat may therefore have a sensible influence on the preparation and conduct of it, consequently will be also a subject of consideration in tactics. This paragraph is particularly important as von Clausewitz in it starts defining the theory of the art of war, distinguishing tactics from strategy and defining also in part their interaction. That here is just hinting at. I mean, this paragraph is not the definitive definition of such things as he has just pointed out. These are things that we have already talked about, and that von Clausewitz will keep explaining in the future. Here, von Clausewitz is fundamentally highlighting how the theory of the art of war has to take into consideration a very concrete aspect of the use of the military instrument, which is the nature of the means and ends, right? Hence, von Clausewitz is talking about context in many ways. He is saying we can't, we have observed it in the first paragraphs, denoting like, making a theory of the art of war simply based on a omnicomprehensive understanding of war, how it works, completely kind of abstracted and extrapolated by actual individual cases. We have to observe fundamentally what the art of war shows us as kind of in continuity, right? Always knowing that every single combat every single war will be fundamentally different, but observing that there are still certain bases over which this happens that are not to represent in every single case. Hence, we can't say, okay, let's just think about them and we will win, or we will at least know what the best solution always is, because this is impossible. But the first attitude is essentially, let's concentrate about actual things. Let's concentrate about the reality of what happens, what our means and ends are, and let's evaluate them case by case, right? So this is what he in fact introduces in the title, in the first phrase. The theory therefore considers the nature of ends and means, and also ends and means in tactics that he starts to discuss as, he at least starts from the battle, expanding to the strategical level, and then he writes, theory has therefore to consider the nature of the means and ends, as we have said. So I would like to stress the concreteness of this statement. I mean, it's not just about coming from what we have observed all before, right? The fact that theory can become possible only when you can start observing it in its actual performance that takes place step by step, right? And therefore the experience that we gain in it fundamentally is getting built upon this, right? And therefore we can bypass other attempts to define a more general yet abstracted and detached theory, as we wish war was, like a mathematically calculable thing, which is most evidently not, especially in war, as more than any other human activity, right? So what he starts with example, talking in fact about tactics, and he writes, in tactics, the means are disciplined armed forces which are to carry on the contest, right? So this is the definition that we've given to it. And so tactics is presents the means of an action that has to be solved through essentially disciplined armed forces, therefore an instrument that we have fundamentally educated, trained, and made fit for combat, right? That have to practically carry out the combat, right? They have to fight for this object that is victory, of course. And von Clausewitz goes on by saying, the precise definition of this conception can be better explained hereafter in the consideration of combat, right? So he will do it at a point, not now, but he says, here we content ourselves by denoting the retirement of the enemy from the field of battle as the sign of victory. This is very important because tactically speaking, there are certain approximations we have to draw in order to understand in part what is when we talk about victory or defeat. But the thing is more shaded than it is, and why? Because there is a connection with strategy, of course, that von Clausewitz now in fact considers, so that you can win tactically but kind of losing strategically as a consequence of it, right? This is mostly known, and vice versa, by the way, which is normally specular. And the retirement of the enemy from the field of battle is, of course, something that occurs also in here. We will see it eventually with a certain amount of frequency. Like we can't generalize about this too in battles as well. There are we should define in this sense what is the field of battle proper. We still haven't done it. The thing is also in here much more shaded than it seems, but we conventionally use this points of reference by now, in fact, as von Clausewitz himself writes here, as the sign of victory, as the enemy abandoning the field. And eventually von Clausewitz writes, by means of this victory, strategy gains the object for which it appointed the combat, and which constitutes its special signification. Let's repeat it because this is important. By means of this victory, strategy gains the object for which it appointed the combat, and which constitutes its special signification. Right? This is very, very important. So the victory fundamentally is an instrument. The strategy is a mean, right? The strategy obtains through this victory. Strategy reaches an end that it had given to combat, right? And that makes up its meaning. This is particularly important because this means that every combat has a meaning that goes beyond the tactical dimension. And obviously it's strategical, right? But there is an interaction between the two elements. And therefore every battle, aside from the strictly tactical outcome, can influence broadly the strategical level. It can also tell us actually a lot of things about certain military systems. Just today I was writing about this. Like I concluded the reconstruction of a battle today, and at the end of it, I had to write what's the signification of this battle. I mean, what is we can learn from it, right? Now it's strange because in this chapter I'm writing basically only that I'm writing right now. I'm just analyzing tactically the situation, right? That also is never quite true 100%, because I have to give some context that eventually influences the same combat, right? You can't start talking about battle out of the blue, especially in historical terms, that is, in concrete terms of what we think was real, and not necessarily true, but still real, for which you have always to go back. Now I started, collecting the sources for another battle, or gathering them at least, and I had to notice that, of course, it's boring now, and it takes me, it's not boring, but it takes me more time. Currently, I'm fighting against time, let's say, and because objectively, there is something that I must know from before, right? If anything, the composition of the armies is something that we know often from before the battle began. I mean, very rarely sources tell us, at the moment of the battle, that certain amount of troops was there. You already know, like, kind of before, these numbers have floated, like, we don't know how they varied. We're also unsure about that. We have to cross other several sources in order to find out what the real picture at the beginning of combat, actually, if it is a strictly tactical analysis, were about. So you understand that you can't never distinguish the two things, but also there is a broader meaning that eventually that same outcome of the battle will have for the rest, so that the combat as such acquires a signification, a special signification, as a matter of fact. It's very important to understand in this perspective, albeit we're kind of instinctively more projected towards battles than towards strategy, because understanding battles is dramatically easier than understanding strategy. We often lack the perception that tactics is actually kind of an ancilla of strategy proper. That this is how von Clausewitz actually defines it, right? It's an aid of strategy, and also it becomes basically a mean, right? It becomes the mean through which giving signification to the same strategical choice, because strategy basically dictates where you're going to use your military instrument, right? And therefore giving a meaning to that, like, so that every battle it can never be considered out of its specific strategic context, but beyond that, it also has an active role in defining what that strategic meaning actually is, and will be also for future battles, future combat. So that's very, very important, and it becomes properly special, right? Because no other around battles and strategical choices revolve not just great part of our military historical interest, but literally, the fate of a lot of people, right? Not just on the battlefield, not even on the front, but in the whole world. So this signification is that special because it's terribly complicated to actually understand, but from it depend an enormous amount of consequences and also of causes. Like, in the sense, you have to determine what happened, also thinking that before the battle there was a situation, after the battle there was another, and what happened in the middle is probably the combat, and this is kind of like part of a stream that, with water was coming from somewhere, it passes in this part and then it goes further, and in the meantime all of this has changed. So this is why it's so important for the theory of the art of war to observe naturally this cause-effect links, um, and as much as we can, in the sense that we quite often don't understand what they are, we have to go by approximation, but hey, there are kind of more or less accurate reconstruction in this sense, and that's why we study military history. And why it is so meaningful. I don't know if you have ever taken a source of a battle, trying to effectively like reconstruct the battle proper, like not just reading a piece of literature, but trying to sort things out, which is kind of obvious as soon as you read the story of battle, because there is in fact a tactical development of some sort. If there are, of course, also enough, if there is also enough data to do that. But the beauty of it is that you do realize when you imagine this, what this could have been. That is something, in fact, much more complicated, because even a few lines of a story of battle can really be very, very problematic to understand. Like, there is very few things, in fact, if nothing like as war, that kind of presents such a high difficulty in reconstructing what effectively happened, right? Because it's many people at the same time doing things in an incredibly coincided way, and therefore chaos ensues. Also, not just for what can happen on battlefield, but also from our side, in order to try to understand what is going on, right? So it's this could open actually to other reflections on, for example, how chaotic, how much of this difficulty is also attributable to the sources themselves, for example, and were the people who were there kind of more aware of what was going on, right, or not. So this would be an interesting I don't know, a topic for a degree, confrontating like modern combat reports, for example. I don't know, from current conflict, current warfare, like in trying to sort out whether they're kind of more reliable, if we have increased, by which degree we have increased the understanding of what happens really on a battle, compared to other sources that were older, and how this has changed in relation with, in fact, what we do politically, socially, the importance also that we give to the military instrument or not, because certain things may be also lost of significance in part, at least if not from the strictly military point of view, which actually has increased this capacity to understand, but also from society and how this affects, in fact, the military instrument strategically and politically, right? And these are big deals, right? And the fascinating aspect of it is that they're all intertwined at the point that when you deal with these topics, you can't really do much to distinguish them, and these are topics that bring you automatically to wonder these things, because they can't be considered one without the other. It can't be measured one without the other. In fact, let's say studying the art of war proper is something very different from studying military history in this sense, right? You can't study military history just making a philosophical treatise of how, I don't know, the concept of strategy evolved without actually even understanding strategy, or at least guessing very broadly what it was about. And there's plenty of books like that, and they don't get into the real thing. And of course, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be written or they're necessarily bad texts. It's just that we should also acknowledge the fact that the more you descend into these details, and the more you realize how they're not minutiae, right? They are actually something that overcomplicates the problem of the very framing of this evidence, right, into an orderly thought, which is not easy. Like, it's it takes a toll, and it's costly. And it's costly in a sense, not just from an intellectual point of view, but also for mistakes that are done eventually on the field, which happens all the time. Right, from strategy to tactics, as a matter of fact, meaning that, of course, this is, the most important choices always come from the top, and it couldn't be otherwise. That's how we work as human beings, with hierarchies, and how, in order to make things work. But von Clausewitz goes on and writes this signification that the object gained by strategy by means of this victory has certainly a victory, as we have defined it at least, has certainly some influence on the nature of the victory, right? This is von Clausewitz actually explains it better in the next phrase. He says, a victory which is intended to weaken the enemy's armed forces is a different thing from one which is designed only to put us in possession of a position. Right? This is kind of self-evident. So, in other words, it's as if there were different ways and different intensities, different aims, in fact, for which combats develop, are enacted in the first place, right? So, the signification of a battle can be of different kinds. There are battles that objectively are not very important. It all depends what the political element here, let's say the political actor here is. There are battles that are considered insignificant at one point in history because objectively they didn't change much, but objectively they enabled, for example, certain characters to rise at one point, which would have not happened otherwise. And therefore we can give a significance to that battle in the ways it was fought in many ways, on the base of this outcome, and as a consequence, as a cause and a consequence, let's say, of the aim that combat had in the at a strategic level. It seems like confused, but actually it's really not. Actually, it's very coherent. Right, von Clausewitz has this way of speaking in circles sometimes, so that you always get to the point of the starting point by reaffirming it, right? And that's quite important for the logical chain that he's able to weave in here, and very, very effectively. And it's obvious here. Here actually he deals with the same concept of Schwerpunkt, right? It's obvious that a battle can have different, even with the same material, the material level, that can be of course the very same forces, your own ones as one of the enemy, and you may easily act in a completely different way depending on whether your objective is to actually annihilate the enemy's armored forces proper, whether what is important here is just to gain a position, right? There are two very different ways that the fight will orient, right? And this is not so easy to let's say that we should use practical examples to actually determine this stuff, but there are certain elements that should be set right before, even to when we start talking about battles. It's fundamental to understand who was attacking, of course, who was defending. These are things that are somewhat bypassed, right? Because they seem so obvious by a certain standard that we don't even need to know. But actually, that largely influences how a fight is carried out, and it's often not easy to realize. So Clausewitz goes on and says the signification of a combat may therefore have a sensible influence on the preparation and conduct of it, consequently will be also a subject of consideration in tactics, right? So the signification of a combat has a direct influence on both on the preparation and the conduct of the same battle, right? And consequently, this becomes significant in tactical terms as well, because at that point, as we've just said, we have to realize who was doing what there, right? Because certain things never end, even when you there are battles in which, of course, there is a, let's say, pitched battles usually are willingly, like there is consensual decision to fight and whatever, but other contexts are kind of different. Like most of the times there are armies confronting for days with trying to lure the enemy to battle. At that point, there are strategical reasons that intervene, like how much you can keep that position in terms of supplies, of even of local hygienic conditions or weather or whichever reason that goes far beyond, like as politics, as a matter of fact, that will at that point determine why a battle is fought in a certain place or another. In fact, what is of extraordinary importance, which is kind of obvious if you're studying a battle, is studying actually a campaign. Like studying the whole campaign, it's difficult sometimes. We need in part to bypass that. Like I'm doing it. I'm writing a whole thesis for my PhD that is fundamentally about tactics, right? There's a very few strategical interest in it, and there's a strict interest for tactics, especially at the level of formation, etc. That obviously is deeply intertwined with politics and society as well. I mean, that's the leitmotif of the thesis in itself. But for example, I don't study the campaign as such, which I do realize I've come to measure at this point in my thesis. So it was maybe a bit late, but it's not that it ruins the thesis in itself, but it could have bettered it. Were it considered, but at that point we'd also miss an enormous amount of information about tactics. That is instead what I'm concentrating on. That, however, can be conjugated eventually with also the strategical notions that you want, right? And tactics are studying a campaign naturally makes you fully understand. Not necessarily all the time, because it depends on the sources as well. For example, who was attacking, who was defending in part, right? I remember in my master thesis I studied this battle in which basically nobody knows who was, at least why, for example, an army made a certain move. And the reason is we don't know at that point, strictly speaking, which strategical reason pushed, which motives pushed that commander to take that action. Well, and even if we can make hypotheses, of course, that's somewhat an exception. But studying a battle framed in the campaign itself helps you tremendously to figure out what the whole problem was, right? It tells you so much about what I'm interested in here is also the dynamic of the battle proper, not just the most obvious fact, who had the highest morale, or who was the fresher one, things like these. The most determined. It's really a matter of literally who started, right? Because that also matters. It also gives significance, in fact, signification to certain positions, right? We have just defined in this paragraph, like the retirement of the enemy from the field of battle as the sign of victory. You have at that point to understand banally what also the field of battle is, right? Because the field of battle is not literally the field, like with grass in flatland. The field of battle can be everything, and it can sometimes not even be. That's why I was making the example before with pitched battles, where everything is usually kind of more concerted and ritualized, and it's usually like a flatland, right? Preferred chosen specifically, etc. Other times it's not. Actually, most of the times, all what also revolves around moves and confronting the enemy. It's really about a moment you have to. You can't stay entire days in front of the enemy without taking action, depending on what your strategical motivation is at that point. And that's also very interesting for the theory of the art of war that von Clausewitz here is kind of trying to I mean, he's succeeding, of course, but he's progressively explaining, it's how it can be effectively can become possible in the first place. That make you realize, I don't know, think about Middle Ages. The fact that most pitched battles, for example, were battles over the contest of a fortress. This is typical. Why? Because normally medieval armies were stopped by castles, right? And because castles at the time were built because they were pretty damn effective at that point. And normally battles were it broke out because there was an army was besieging another that came to relieve the siege, and that's how they arrived to the thing. So I mean, there is a lot that sometimes in strategy is very difficult because you never know what you don't really have the exact measure of the factors that will push, right? And probably, I mean, strategy is also a matter of guts, right? And it's that matter of talent, which the same von Clausewitz talks about. It obviously comes through experience, and it's difficult to get. Like, I personally, in my path, like, I study military history seriously since I don't know, in like 10 years or maybe a bit more, and I think I acquired a discrete understanding of tactics, for example. With strategy, I realized that it's more complicated, and sometimes I realize it's not always 100% clear why and how certain things were happening. I mean, of course, if it is explained to me, that's easy, right? We have an historiography. That's why we study studies. We don't just study sources. But if I were just to have sources, well, that's I can assure you, it's very, very, very difficult. I tried multiple occasions. It's very, very difficult, and it's not easy at all. It blows your mind sometimes to see how it's like I don't know which example to make, but it's like those rebuses, like those things that the riddles that until you don't get the mechanism that makes that relieves the spring, let's say, you don't get it. But the interesting part of the story is that when you get it, then you will not forget it, because it will blow your mind at that point, like saying, how couldn't I see it? It's a bit like when you when you solve a problem of Euclidean geometry, right? There is not really a solution by manual, like analytic geometry, for example, trigonometry. You have the picture in front of you, but still you have to sort out the whole thing, and there is nothing there to help you if not some theory, right? And that's the cool thing, and that's a very interesting parallelism that in fact reveals here that makes a good example for what the relation here is between, in fact, the theory of the art of war. Even of course in geometry everything is dramatically simpler than in war, but I mean over exceedingly simpler, and that gives you a measure of how, in fact, solving strategical problems is difficult. That is, you have a set of theory that are, let's say, it's not that they are true. Well, there is an actual difference, because in maths, like in geometry, you have those laws that are always true. The problem is to spot that into the system. I mean, war is kind of different, because the theory is more floating, and it's as if you, geometrically speaking, you had the largest part of the figure, the geometrical shape, hidden to your side, right? And that's, as you understand, way more complicated, right? And that's also part of the reason why at that point there can't be a positive theory of the art of war, because it would be like making it a geometrical notion, which is, ironically speaking, what Jomini, von Clausewitz's greatest rival, but also eventually, person who recognized von Clausewitz's genius, and that tells you how intelligent and humble and actually, nice Jomini was. I don't remember where the phrase was going, but is impossible, right? Because Jomini was reducing everything to a set of geometrical relations, and war cannot be like that. And that's where you really get von Clausewitz's genius, because he bypasses a problem that he evidently saw firsthand as meaningless in front of what war was waged like at his times, and von Clausewitz waged war himself as a general. So realizing how these problems are pressing, and it will always be, and how you can find much better solution than, of course, using reason and understanding and kind of maths as well, but always framing it in a completely different dimension, which is from let's say a completely intelligible picture. That is what von Clausewitz, in fact, said at the very beginning of this paragraph. That is, theory has, therefore, to consider the nature of the means and ends. Right? Theory should be busy, should be preoccupied with what the means are and the ends are. That is context, which means, in other words, what the hell is the matter here? What do you want to do? And this is, and how can you do it? What do you have at your disposal? What is that you know? And all these answers are, in fact, all these questions, are answered only when you start assessing practically what's the deal, and try to find a solution that works, not trying to think it in a kind of an abstract fashion in order to have a manual that solves every single unsolvable problem, that objectively you never come to solve for real. Like, there is never a real solution in the theory of the art of war. Like, there is never a complete solution to everything. There will always be something that is left to debate, and this is also why military history exists in the first place, and why we don't deal with historical matters in general, with exact sciences, let's say strong sciences, whatever you want to call them, because it's essentially social science. It's different. Even if the method should be, even for von Clausewitz, scientific. Like, for the same von Clausewitz, the single most important thing is intelligence and rationality, which can't work alone, but those would be, however, the most important in terms of, causes of effect of what happens, of success, because they are rational. They are kind of mathematical, but just of a tiny bit of the whole, the 3/4 of which, by definition, as von Clausewitz himself explained us, we do not know, and we cannot know, because we can't, especially in those very conditions that require taking action, right? So it's very thought-provoking from my perspective, and I think there is, most importantly, in this concept of means and ends, a great concreteness, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, but also great clarity, because concreteness makes you think faster, kind of in logical, reasonable terms that have to make you assess what is going on. Like, is when you have, especially when you are under pressure, right? And that's why war actually is military experience, direct military experience, is so important for saying von Clausewitz. In order to understand this art of war, because it pressures you at the point you have to start thinking faster, which is normally what theoreticians do not do, like nor I do or you do probably if you've never been to war. When we study military history at home or whatever, and we're kind of calm, hopefully, and relaxed, and we're kind of thinking stuff because we're not pressured, or maybe we're pressured by time, by deadlines, etc., and that makes us understand in parallel, as an example, but how fast and how accurately and how and also with certain setbacks and flaws, we can, however, and we must reason concretely in front of problems, right? So thinking about literally means and ends, right? We have to clearly identify what do we want and how do we want to achieve it. Well, this is in a nutshell, of course, what we all do in every single situation, including war. And this is what von Clausewitz is trying to tell us, because he's not interested in explicitating the specific aspect that is, that life is just a bit like war. After all, the same Latins wrote "Vivere militare est," right? And it is true, as a matter of fact. But this means of the Vom Kriege also a great philosophical work. It's not just about war. It's really a life coach, right? A life trainer, and definitely, think about the human dimension of this, like human experience of this person, right? In that specific context that we have discussed so many times. Well, it's meaningful, so you should be listening to him, because if you really want to find a person that doesn't reason abstractly, well, you find the right person. Von Clausewitz is the right person for you, and he can help you really a lot. And that's how simple, actually, what makes you, many people don't know or don't want to know von Clausewitz because he's apparently difficult. The truth is that he's not, right? And he's very, it's difficult to understand the whole work because it requires learning, studying, so you can't kind of do it with a snap. But if you have the commitment, it's fairly easy to understand step by step. So there is also nothing kind of exoteric into it. Like, you can get into it quite rationally, and he helps you dramatically into this journey because he has a prose that is exceptional. He's extremely logical, but not all. You've realized that von Clausewitz's prose is also very poetic at times, but with an extremely concrete view. I have in mind so many parallelisms, even from medieval thinkers, that to which, there's a broad synthesis of many disciplines in this work. You realize that this work has required to von Clausewitz an understanding of physics, of chemistry, of history. Even of things that you would not normally care, like a philosophy, when you think about actually how to win a war, right? And this is all important. And that's why, by the way, a military historian should know all these things. You can't think to study war thinking it's just a mechanical stuff, for example, or just a humanistic stuff. It's not. You must know kind of everything in order to perfect your knowledge, and it's one of the most didactic, if not actually the widest of all the human sciences. If you really, probably, right? But I'm confident about it. So yeah, the paragraph was mostly it, and so we're starting to get a slightly more in depth. In fact, von Clausewitz also will start now to list those circumstances which always attend the application of the means. There are the locality, the time of the day, the weather, and this, there are new means that are formed. Also, what is interesting in this whole concept is that the situation evolves constantly, right? And that constitutes the major difficulty, and that's why I would say direct military experience is more didactic than military history, by certain degrees, of course, which depend. Because while we study military history as, in fact, just with all the time in the world, the people on the field didn't have all the time in the world. So this had a match, and also we are not pressured as they were. If anything, risking our own life. So that process was much more intense, and much more, I think you can't forget about a battle that you study in your life. You may not forget that battle if you were part of it. Right? There is a sensible difference between the two things. And that's exactly in part what the deal is. Like, realizing that everything evolves dramatically fast in certain situations, and you have to find new means to new ends. Or you can't bypass that problem. You can't think, that, in fact, that military actions as isolated. And that's what this paragraph starts showing you, like the fact that there is always actually another paragraph that we will read in later times. And I don't know what to add. I would say, yeah, we can stop here, even if it's shorter than the usual, but I think I got to the point. And these paragraphs are all kind of short, as you understand. Eventually we'll have very, very long ones. In fact, actually, I adopted this formula of making a paragraph at a time. Just, I think, once I made like a paragraph in 2 chunks because it was too demanding. But in the future we will have much longer stuff. Let me check. But we arrived fundamentally, okay, maybe not to, like, between 1/4 and 1/3 of the Vom Kriege, and there is a lot to know, right? And it's a pity, like, this stuff should be taught to anyone who begins to start. Okay, preferably you should start reading the Précis de l'art de la guerre by Jomini first, right? Of course, von Clausewitz is more famous, of course, but also more. But reading Jomini first, that is actually a very interesting read as well, and then coming to von Clausewitz kind of is way more useful because it demolishes all of your prejudices. That if you're willing to understand that, of course, when you eventually read von Clausewitz, because Jomini also writes actually pretty interesting aspects of war, but he pretends to give them a kind of a universal value, and that is to make it a positive theory out of it. And von Clausewitz destroys this and rebuilds it on a different base, but kind of with the same material. But this is just now another consideration like this. Alright, so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.